Recording, great. Okay, so let's say we have some page. This page is app.jsx, and ultimately what it exposes is a component called app. So maybe inside of here, I'll say, this is where we're creating this thing called app, which is a component. And now let's write my definition for app. My definition for app is going to be, obviously it might do stuff before the return, but the return is what I really care about. And let's say the return looks like this. So I have some kind of, fragment like that. Could just as well be a div, doesn't really matter. And then inside I have an H1 and I'll say my app, and I'll make a pretty simple thing here. So we're just gonna have H1 my app. But we're also going to reference some other thing. We're going to call this one profile. So that has to be imported for us to know about it. But let's say we're referencing this thing profile. Okay, so now very similar. We're going to have, a different component. I'll just move it over here. And this component profile is going to reference, I'll change the names of it in a second. It's going to reference this other file, profile.jsx, and that itself is going to have something that looks like, it's a profile. And let's just say for now, what a profile looks like is something like, H2, my name. But right now it's just static there. It's just my name, right? So the essential idea of props is that sometimes, just like calling a function, you want to give it parameters, right? So when I see profile here, let me move this down a little. If I see profile, a little explanation here. When I encounter profile, it's almost like I'm saying, okay, so render profile is more or less the equivalent of, call function profile, and then, whatever the results of profile are, go in here. So now the question is, just like with a function, I want to say something like call function, profile, and then maybe it takes an argument like Ben for the name. Now the question is, what am I writing at the, at this level that is the equivalent? So the way we do that is props. So this first thing is the no props example. And that second thing is a props example. Maybe we'll put a little line there to separate them. Okay, so now how am I going to render profile with a prop? Well, assuming it doesn't take any content, it can still be self-closing, but I'm going to say something like name is equal to Ben. Move that over. Okay. So what are we doing here with name equals Ben? Well, it's the equivalent almost of this profile Ben, but because we might have other ones, we might have name Ben. What's another quality of Ben? I'm tired of using the name. I'll open it up to the class. What's another quality that's unique to a person?
ID number.
ID number. Yeah, very safe answer. Yeah, so let's say, and let's just say we pass it as a number. We might do it like that, right? And I'll say 44. That's Ben's ID number. So we don't want to do it like this ultimately. Like it's still ultimately calling a function, but instead of calling it like a function Ben 44, the problem with that is that order now matters. And so the solution React came up with is that we're not going to be passing it individual arguments. We're only ever passing it one argument like this. That argument is going to be an object. And like all objects, you got to give names to these values, or keys and value pairs. So really this is what we're calling when we are trying to create a profile. And what does that look like in here? Okay, well, coming back here, Honestly, instead of writing app here, I'll write like, function app, because that's what it really is. It's a component. Okay, and here we have function profile, but in that first one, I didn't give it any arguments. Over here, I'm actually going to give it a single argument called props. So props is going to hold this object, and you can destructure here if you want it. Up here, you can destructure in the body before the render, but it's perfectly fine to not destructure at all. So what I can do here now is wrap it in these curlies and say props.name. And maybe we have another one below it where I say, h3 props.id, and then that would be there. So this is the essentials of props that, I guess I should fill this in over here, that we can actually pass it data. And if that data happens to be anything other than a string, we can work with it using the curlies, because that will interpret JavaScript. I guess something like that. Okay. So this is the essence of props, and something tells me you guys more or less follow that, but it is good to repeat it because props is, far more essential than context. So do we feel good about props right now? Any questions about props before I compare it to context?
I had a quick question.
Yes.
So for prop drilling, we would have to recall those props within profile,
Yeah, that's a great question.
it down to a lower element.
So yeah, let's actually see that, because even if we're only comparing, passing something down 2 levels to 1 levels, that makes the use case for context. So let's say in profile itself didn't just, display some stuff it got from app, but maybe instead of something like this, instead of props.id, maybe it actually had, it's silly, why would I do this? But it had a component called like, ID, because maybe there's lots of information we pass, and that itself is going to take a prop called ID. And notice that when I give it the name, I'm just giving it the name ID, but its value in this context will be props.id. So now what's an ID? Well, that's its own component. Unlike an H2, that's not something that we already know about. So I'm going to do the same thing as I did over here. Something like that. Okay. And what do we have over here? Well, we have this thing, ID, referencing a component called ID. And this is what it looks like. And it has one thing on it called ID. And let's just say, okay, all that does ultimately, I don't even need these because there's only one thing. All that does is return an H3 with props.id. But now we can already see, what the use case for context might be, which is all my data. Let's say, we had a use state for this stuff. All my data is living at this top level of app, and then it's being passed to the profile. Profile only uses name, but because it has a component ID inside of it, and ID needs this property ID, profile needs to be passed both name and ID. It uses name. But for ID, it just passes it a level deeper. So if we were to say what props these needs, it's sort of like, I'm going to have, what props does this use? I'll say, something like relies on nothing. And in this case, relies on name. Maybe I'll pull this up. I'll say relies on name, passes, or maybe even I'll say uses. So it uses name. So this uses nothing. This uses name. It passes ID. So we gave it ID just so it could pass at another level. And in this case, this one actually uses ID. So this is the simplest version of a complex version of this thing we can think of, where we're passing stuff down one level. but we're only using one thing. Another thing we pass down another level, and then that level uses it. And you'd probably want it to be, a fair bit more complicated before you wanted to use context, but let's see how we would use context, right?
Ben, before you move to
Yeah.
context, so in this case, right, the props are passing things to elements within the same page, right? So everything's going to have a my app at the top. It's going to have profile ID.
Mhm.
So props are passing things within an element. Is there a case where I could pass things as props to another page, would have a completely different display?
Well, when you say a different page, you mean a
Kind of
different
like,
page like using React Router?
yeah, like what we did in the video assignment,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We create a brand new
So
page for.
the thing is, when we're using React Router behind the scenes, it's still just all components. It's a single page as far as like, you're not like, right, you're not going to a different page. If you're asking, can you use props with outlet with that way of, filling in a part of the page with a given component? I don't believe so. It doesn't seem to play well with props. It is relying on context. And I think the reason it does that is because context is the more powerful solution. So if you have a way of doing something with props, you still might also need a way of doing it with context. But if one knows how to use context, theoretically, they never have to use props. And so I think for the sake of outlet, they just said, let's give one solution as opposed to two, with one less powerful than the other. But I would say, I saw someone write this in the chat. You're going to stick with props until you don't need it, or until you need something better. I agree with that 1,000%. That's the right way to approach programming. Everything is a tool. If all you need is a regular screwdriver, don't go out and buy a drill. Go out and buy a drill when you run into a problem that none of your tools can actually solve yet. And I think I said this to some people yesterday, but I managed to get to the senior level of being like a pure front end engineer without ever learning context. I just never explicitly needed it. I think maybe some libraries I used it. I learned context for the sake of like teaching at boot camps because we thought, oh, that's another one to teach. But that kind of highlights how sometimes, education and like practical engineering gets separated, because it is a useful thing to know, but you could go pretty far without knowing it. And it's only once you encounter it that you'd say, what is that? And then you could Google it, and then you'd read about it. Whereas you can make no progress, or not very much progress, in React without props. Props is an essential idea. The only more essential idea is components. So without components, you don't have anything. But components aren't super useful until you give them props. Now you can, pass an argument to that function. And context is like, okay, so if props is your screw, or what am I saying? If props is your screwdriver and context is your, power tool, I don't even know wait, I messed up my analogies. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The point is, context is not, it's not going to be needed for every job. It might not even be needed for most jobs. What would Miley do? Yeah, it's a great question. Islam John is asking, to stop propagation work with context? There's no reason it wouldn't, but this is where things get confusing. Like, what's the React world? What's just the regular JavaScript world? Context is a specific feature of this library called React. Event.stop propagation, that is in vanilla JavaScript. And that's to prevent, this bubbling up of an event, which is something that will happen by default in anything in JavaScript that, is working with an event. So I see how that's a little confusing, but if something's built into HTML, CSS, JavaScript, it definitely works with blank library, because it's at the language level. It's at the, you can't not have that that behavior of propagation, and then this function that allows you to work with it, stop propagation, that's built in at the browser / JavaScript level. So everything has to work with it. If it doesn't, that's a problem with React and with context, that it doesn't work with it, but it does. Okay, so anything more on this, or do we want to see the context stuff now? And for everyone asking about with the different pages in context, we'll go over that during the review today. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the context way of doing things. And to do that, I might copy a lot of this. And that is going to let me, I'll just copy it like that. Now we're going to see the context way of doing this. And if I share this, I can put titles on it. You know, this first one is like that. I'll say 1, passing data with props. And then 2, passing data with context. Right. So I'll just move this down a little. Fill in all that in a second. So passing data with context. The first thing is that we might well have another file called context or called something context. It doesn't explicitly need to be another file, but either way, it needs to be exported. But I'm going to do it like this because this helps us see what context is, how it's like shared. So I'm going to make a file here and I'm going to call it, let's say, profile context.jsx. And what that's going to do is ultimately export a context. We use this built-in React tool called, this built-in React function called create context. And that's going to look more or less something like this. This is something that is being exported. So maybe I'll say, I can just write the whole thing in here. I'll say const, context equals create context, and that's going to be a function you'll have to import, but we'll do it like this. Context equals, we're creating a context. We give it the starting value of null, and we'll see what that means in a second. It's holding a value null, so it's holding nothing basically. And then at the end, we will say export default context so that other things can include it. So the first thing is that in here, we're going to be able to access that context called, we can call it what we want when we import it. We'll call it the same name as the file, profile context. And so now coming here, I'm going to do the same thing I did before, but I'm not actually, where is it? I'm not going to give these values name and ID like this. I'm not going to pass them in like that. And let's just say they live up here beforehand. They live at name equals Ben and ID equals 44. So let's just say, these could be use states. Let's just say these are just values I'm passing because it won't make a difference for this example. Okay, so now I'm just showing my profile, but my profile needs access to data. So what I'm going to do is take that context from up here. Where was it? I called it profile context. And what I'm going to say is, okay, profile context has something in it called dot provider. And not like anything else, but in this case, it's going to not be self-closing. Instead, it's going to look something like this, where I close it like that. And then inside of it, in this case, I'm just showing profile. But the idea is anything inside of that provider, including anything rendered, from profile, will have access to this context. And we're not quite done yet because this provider, if you don't do this, React will yell at you, which is wise. It needs to be given a value. So I'll say value equals to, and right now its value, as we see up here, its default value is null. So we get to fill that in with this value prop. And what does that value prop take? Well, I'm going to open the curly braces to say what I'm going to be putting in here now is JavaScript. And then what I'm actually passing it is going to be an object. And that object in this case, for me, I'm just going to say, okay, it has a name with value. Then, well, I'm not going to say it like that. It's going to have a name, and that name is going to have the same value as this thing in our current. I say context because that's what, the context of this file app.jsx has something called name in it, but I don't want to confuse you. So not talking about React context. So I'm just going to say name and ID, and those are going to be filled in. Now we have an object with something on it called name equal to Ben and something on it called ID equal to 44. Okay, so now name and ID are inside of this object, and this object is going to be the single value that all these context things are going to be aware of. Okay, now coming to profile, we're not going to be using props anymore. Instead, we're going to be able to write something up here like use context. And use context has to take in the specific context it uses, because there could be more than one, and that, would be imported. But what we're going to do here then is use context takes that profile context. And this is why I wanted to draw it like this. It's like this profile context. It's coming from here. So we're not like, we don't have to think about it in terms of like passing props. This, profile thing over here, it does point to something that it renders, but we're not passing any props around. This is how we pass the props around. And what is it equal to? Well, it equals to that object I passed in as value, which I'm going to just destructure as name and ID. But actually, I only need name at this level. So what context is there for is to save me from passing things around to other levels. Because this only uses name, I'm only going to reference name. So I don't need to pull everything off of it. I'm just pulling name off of it. And now I can say, name. And now in terms of ID, I'm also not going to pass it anything. I'll just do it like this, because it's itself going to have access to the same context. So I want to come up here to grab all this stuff. Okay, this is what I want this to have. Okay, so now this, again, we're not going to take the props. We're ultimately going to do, show the ID, because it's inside of the context. So coming back here, we see, well, only profile is in the context, but profile renders ID. So ID is also in the context, because it's as if we replace profile with everything in here. And so ID still is in that same, it's wrapped in that component. And so just like up here, we have a very similar line. I'll grab this line. I'll copy it. We have access to that context. We're going to peel off just ID. And we have a similar line to say, yep, it's the same context we're working with here. So maybe I'll take these arrows out to make that a little simpler. The arrows that imply we're rendering something else. And in a sense, because it's being imported and because we use profile context.provider, this file just as much is referencing the same context. So that context is a single file now. And instead of having to pass things down at all these levels, it's just this thing that lives outside that they can all reference. And yeah, this is now the solution. So if we zoom out a little, not that much, we see the difference. In this case, simpler ultimately, we're just passing things down level to level to level as props. In the context case, we're not passing anything down level to level to level as props. They're all referencing this single thing called context that holds that data. And this use context function handles the passing. And the reason why that's useful is because if I were to add, 8 more examples here, like 8 more levels, we'd have to be passing them level to level to level to level. And it's almost like at each level, we'd say, okay, you use this, but you have to pass a bunch more things. You use this, but you have to pass a bunch more things. And that can get tiring because the purpose of props is really to pass data to something, not to pass data to something so it could pass data to something, but it itself doesn't need it. So it just kind of makes your code. This is a simple version of it, and it's not so ugly yet, but the fact that we're passing ID down from app to profile, and then we're passing ID from profile to ID, but we're never using ID at the profile level. Profile is just there to, make the handoff. That is a little ugly, not super ugly, but it would get ugly fast if we had 4 things we were using and 100 things we were just passing down a level. So that's all context really solves for you. It just makes it a little cleaner where you don't have to do that prop drilling thing. So now things only have to reference what they actually use, and they just peel off what they want from the context.
Ben, can you do an example where ID is not an element within the profile, but a standalone page, and how you would, I'm assuming it would be like a link, like reference to the ID, right?
You're saying it's we're using React Router now and they're standalone pages?
Yeah, exactly. So let's say ID is a standalone page, right? So I would essentially have a brand new HTML code on the ID JSX, and then I would link profile to ID via a link. Is that right?
No, I think this is where
Outlet
we want
context,
to
right?
use outlet context. Yeah. So I mean, you asked for it, I can do it. Let's do the exact same thing, and you'll see that because we're like it's going to be basically use outlet context by its name. I know it's just using use context under the hood. It's just saying like, hey, we can make this a little simpler because we know exactly what you're working with. Okay, so I'll copy this just so I can come down here. And I'll print all this for everybody as an Excalibur thing. Okay, now we're saying 3. Passing data to different pages with use outlet context. Okay, so what changes? Well, I'm still going to talk about it out here, but it's not actually its own file. But I'm going to call this outlet context. Just be empty for now. Okay, so now here I have my app. Let's say app is the root thing, but app is working with component, right? Sorry, app is working with outlet. So instead of having all this here, I'm going to replace that. I just have outlet. And let's say we have our router file somewhere. So, all of this is really being rendered because we have our router.jsx file, and that's our real root that's setting everything up. And all it's going to say is, slash points to app. So I guess we have good arrows here. So slash is associated with app, but app itself has children. So it's like we're doing this where I'm going to say, so slash equals, slash always does app, but if it's, exactly slash, so I'll say index. So when it's index true and it's exactly slash, then we're going to replace outlet with a child, and that child is going to be home page. And then in the case where it's not just slash, but it's like, the whole thing is now, I'll replace this with exactly slash. Whereas this one is actually going to be slash, maybe we'll say slash user, slash, comma ID, something like that. And that is going to be associated with a new page I'm going to call user page. Okay. So coming back here, we have our app, and the app shows outlet. Outlet is going to be replaced with homepage or user page. So I'm realizing it almost, it'll be easier just to get rid of some of this stuff. Just draw some new stuff. So what I want to do first is actually give something to the outlet. So let's say there's data that every page needs to know about. So maybe all the data lives at this level or something, or maybe it's something like this where it's like, okay, everything here is going to have, I'm going to have something called users, and this could be a use state, but users is itself going to take like, multiple objects. Maybe I'll open it up like that. So I have something at this level called users. Every user has a name, and they also have an ID. So I'll say like 44. And we'll have another user right after this. So I want to see that I have more than one user. I'll clean that up. Give me a second. So this is ultimately what we're returning, but this is some data we rely on. And what is that other thing? I guess I can make it a little smaller so it's not taking up the whole page. So this is our first user in this list, and this will be our second user, and they have ID 101. Their name is Pikachu. Right, so let's say I have this whole list of users, right? So then what I might do here is I'm going to say, okay, outlet isn't just outlet. It actually takes a single prop, and we didn't define this. This is how React Router defined it. It takes a single prop. That prop is called context, and it takes an array. It takes any value. And in this case, I'm going to escape it and then say the value it takes is an object. I'm going to give one thing on that object called users, because that's just a nice pattern to do. And so now I'm going to say, okay, what's in the context? This whole thing is in the outlet context, so anyone can reference this context. So now we have two cases for outlet. One case for outlet is going to be this thing, homepage. So I'll put that over here. Maybe I'll write something like, user, or, navigate to slash. Can I turn this? Yes, I can. I love that. So when we navigate to slash, now we're replacing outlet with the home page. Might as well keep this pattern going. So here's my home page. In my home page, what does my home page do? Maybe it lists something for every user. So it's just going to have like a div. And then maybe we do that thing where we say like, okay, well, we'll talk about how we get the users in a second, but I'm going to say users.map. And, for each user, we're going to do something. And, it doesn't really matter, but the idea is I need all of my users in order to show my homepage. So how do we do that? Well, we are going to get a function from React Router that we import called useOutletContext. We don't have to give it any argument because it knows automatically the context we're working with, which is this context, passed into the outlet, which I'm representing up here. And then from there, I can just destructure it and say, right, we want our users. So that's what we would do for the homepage. And what about for this situation? Can I grab both of them? No, not quite. So now I'm going to say, well, what if we actually had something else? We're not navigating to slash, we're navigating to slash users slash, 44. So what happens there? Well, because we're navigating to slash users and because we set it up in the router object over here, that's going to reference user page. Grab that whole thing. There we go. Here's my user page. So how does my user page work? Well, my user page can grab all the users using that same thing, use outlet context. But, because this is the user page, it probably only wants to work with that specific user. So that gives us access to another, or we have access to another hook that is built into React Router. In this case, we're going to reference something called, let's see what we gave the name of the param ID, just regular old ID. So when someone goes to users/44, they're going to be going to slash users, and then that /44 part, the 44 is going to be able to be pulled off like this. And I will say use params. And that's how I got that. And then at this point, I might do some logic to say like const, my user, whatever you want to say, like this user is equal to, and then I might say like users dot find, where user should just be little user there, where user dot ID. So yeah, here we're just saying, we're grabbing the users, we're grabbing that ID from the param, then we're getting that specific user. And then at that point, I might be able to say, okay, well, I have an H2, and that's going to be, that's going to represent that specific user's name. So I'll say like this user dot name. And then similarly, I might have my H3. And I say this user dot ID. And so I guess I should stop drawing these arrows with the context, but the idea is that both of these are perfectly aware of this context. And so, yeah, it really is a third case, but it's the same thing as context where, there's something outside they're all capable of referencing now. So if I were to move this, maybe I would say something like, because this will make it a little easier to read this outlet context. It's created at the level of app. But they both have access to this data. So maybe really the arrow should be drawn this way. They both have access to this same data because that's the point of context. That kind of the data lives outside to some degree. Okay, so let's discuss that.
Ben, I'm sorry. The fact that the my app is with the H tag in app.js, that H1 tag, it's it's all within the outlet context is underneath that my app. Is my app H1 going to show up in every one of those pages?
Yes, exactly.
So how do I get it out? How do I make it not show up in every one of those pages?
Okay, well, if you really want these things to be totally separate, then you don't use the children pattern. So I could easily have, made a page where I wasn't just saying, on slash always show app, but on exactly slash homepage, on slash user slash ID show user page. I could have said, a different thing entirely. And that's why what router.js, its object is not just an object, it's an array. So I could have made, something else where I said, there is no common ground between these two pages. Instead, when you're on exactly slash, you always show the home page. And same deal when you're on exactly slash user slash ID, you always show the user page. Now you're not using app. Now you're not using context. Now you're not using use outlet context. So now this whole thing doesn't apply. Instead, you're probably just going to want to have all that data you're working with at the router.jsx level or at the homepage itself level. Because if you had it at the router.js level, once again, you could like use props. It's only because of outlet that you have to do that use outlet context approach. So if they really have nothing in common, you would just write a different sort of router.
Perfect. Thank you so much for explaining that.
But in general, it's if they really have nothing in common, right? They're two separate pages. I would just have whatever data homepage needs. Homepage is responsible for. You don't pass it in as props. Instead, homepage, requests that data, creates that data, whatever it is. Same with user page. But it's a way more common situation that you're going to have something like this where, and this can be nested. So, homepage itself could have, you always show something on homepage, but depending on homepage something, you show this child, in another branch, you show another child. But this is a really common pattern, which is why we teach it, which is there's something you want to show on every page, which is my app. And then there's something on that page that gets replaced depending on the rest of your path. And that's what this part handles. And if those two different paths need common data, you do that with outlet context.
I could do like a LinkedIn navbar and header on the app, right? And then have them all share a navbar.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm just calling it app here, but right, that's what's super common, that like instead of having, H1 my app, that's pretty silly. You'd have a navbar because websites tend to have that format where there's a part of the page that's always there no matter what. And there's a part of the page that gets updated. That's actually, and that's reminding me, because I think you just said LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn is what I'm going to start using as the example for something I could show you, because I don't want to sign into my Facebook or whatever. I don't even have Facebook right now. But I can show this. This is always going to be work appropriate, almost by, by design. Okay. I don't know who these people are, but right, exactly. So if we were to like look at this page, even without inspecting it, we can say, okay, everything on LinkedIn, whether I go to my network, whether I go to jobs, some stuff changes, but this bar is there no matter what. And you can tell because we're not doing a real refresh. You would see like that loading circle, at least for a second. If it was, this is a single page app. When we go to home, it's actually /feed. When we go to my network, that URL updates, the page updates, but some part of it stayed exactly the same. Which is pretty cool, right?
For the usefulness of like being able to use a user ID on the navbar, and without the user having to physically type it into the URL, so we would create a button like that search like LinkedIn has, and then on submit we would be able to use the ID of that button or something.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, if what you're saying is like back here, like, okay, like I don't want the user to have to actively type in, users /44. Well, the way we'd probably have it is like each one of these users would render like maybe like a little user component. And if you clicked on that, that would go right to that user page, like users /their ID. And so, right, through either clicking or on the homepage, we could also have a general search bar. You have some way that you're picking up data and then using that data to populate some new URL that you navigate to.
What does that look like when you're passing like a request like that through a button again? Would you mind showing that real
Yeah,
quick?
why not? Okay, so
And if people need to take a break, we could do it after, I guess. I
I
don't
mean,
want
I
to
could see how this would be useful eventually to have like all of these things, but let's say we actually filled this out where I said like, every user here, I'm gonna make this real simple. We have a single user, we have the whole user, and then every user is going to match to some kind of user component, and then lowercase user, maybe I just pass that as a prop, right? Because there's nothing wrong with passing things as a prop if you know the exact component you're rendering as opposed to the outlet type thing. So at that point, I have my individual user page. I'll put that up here. It's getting kind of crowded, as you can see. So what does that look like? Well, that's going to be user.jsx function user. Let's say that is a thing that now, so it's not the user page, it's just like represents a little user. But yeah, it's probably going to be pretty similar to this, where I'll grab this part. So it doesn't represent the whole page. Each one of these little things is mapped through and is going to be inside of the home page. But it's going to be like a div, and we got this prop called user. So we'll change how that works a little, right? We have props, and it's ultimately going to look pretty similar where we have props, but we just passed in a single user. So I'll do something like that. And now I'm saying for that one user, this, for that one user, this. And then your question is, well, what happens when I click on this? So in that case, I have this on click. And then that on click is going to be a callback function. And as someone pointed out, which I got to wrap in the curlies, of course. And as someone pointed out yesterday, if I want to use the use navigate hook, I don't actually have to create a whole use effect callback function thing. I actually, at the same level, I do other hooks. Let me move this down. At the same level I do other hooks, I can say, okay, const navigate equals use navigate. So use navigate is a hook that is provided for us from React Router. Because of that top level rule, we actually have to call it here. So we get this function called navigate, but then that can be called anywhere. And then what I would say here is something like, okay, when they click on this button, navigate. What do we navigate to? Well, I'm going to want to use one of these backtick strings because I want to put something inside of it. But what they navigate to is first /users. But then we also want to give it that ID. So the ID is user.id. And now this is a fully working thing where, let me zoom out a little. It's pretty big, but basically when someone is at, when someone goes to slash, that renders app no matter what. If it's exactly slash, it's going to follow this path. We render the home page. The home page itself relies on another component, user. So that's going to render this user thing over here. And when we render user, user shows some data. It was passed into it as props. So because this was outlet, we have to get that data with use outlet context. But once we have that data, we can pass stuff to subcomponents as props in the normal way. And on this prop, we're going to use navigate to point us to a new URL. That URL /users/ in this case, for the first one, it would be 44. For the second one, it would be 101. So depending on which one they do, when you click on that navigate thing, now we're all the way back here again. It's almost like there is an arrow here. And now it says, okay, they're at /user. Okay, because they're at slash, we're still going to show this page app, but we're going to replace outlet now with whatever's at /user/:id. So we go to user page. Now we go to this page that represents just that one user. Because it's being replaced with outlet, we use outlet context to grab the entire list of users. The ID is actually coming from the URL now. So just like we filled it in over here, it's aware of its parameter over here with ID. We pull that out with use params. Then we can get that specific user as a result. And then we display some stuff for the user. So there's a lot going on, but it's
What does that homepage look like on the browser? So like you have the div with the user.map. It is nothing gonna be on there? I'm kind of confused.
no, so inside of this div, we're doing a map
Yep.
for each thing in the map. So there's two users for each user, we're going to be rendering this user component. So what we're going to have essentially is two, just like the titles for the inventory yesterday, we're going to have two boxes representing both users.
Oh,
And each
okay.
one is going to be able to be clicked on. And when clicked on, we'll go to a page that represents just that user. But of course, it'll also have the My App.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was saying. I was like, yeah, this example is like how the video store one is set up. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes. But if we wanted to make a search function like the LinkedIn has, we would need to make the button within not the home page, but within the user.
Well, if you wanted a search bar, maybe you'd want it an app and then it's shared like with it for everyone. So then whether you're on the homepage or you're on the user page, you could type in a new search thing, press the button, and then you would navigate to that page. So just like in LinkedIn, I mean, search bars are very commonly shared by all but you know, that's part of the nav bar because search is like the ultimate way of navigating if it's a good search bar.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that's a fair amount. I feel like it would be a good idea to actually like build this thing during that review thing we do. So I feel like from in the review, almost from scratch, we can build something up that's the equivalent of the assessment for, but not to do with Pokemon type stuff. We could use a different API to show the use effect stuff, but we can build something pretty similar. And that will help. But for now, I'll say, okay, we've covered this. Hopefully this is useful. I'm going to be able to export this as it turns out. Because I keep writing on the same page, as far as I know, I can't export just the one thing I care about, which is a small downside to doing things this way. But yeah, if I go into downloads, what do I want to call this? You guys don't need to know this part. Call the last one Excalibur, but this is like, you know, React Day 5 review session. And I believe that's going to produce a nice, something nice for us. It's going to be pretty large, but I just want to make sure that when I zoom in, it looks right. Yeah, this looks good to me. I mean, there's a lot here. It's cool. It's useful. I want more of our curriculum to just look like this because this, I like drawing. Yeah. So I will share this with the class right now. Show you how easy that is to do. Actually, no, I shouldn't share Slack with you. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm just going to resume recording. Share the screen. Hopefully everybody had a nice break. Let's go to Hacker News right now. Okay, so the next thing to do is actually talk today's lecture. See what that looks like. CD, uniform curriculum. That up. Okay. So we're on 7 React.js, day 5. Couple things here. So we do have an example project here. We'll open that up, but we also have this document, the React testing document. So I want to turn that into Markdown. Let's talk about it. So this first part, we're just going to be talking basically. Most of it's going to be just example code, not stuff we're actually running. But eventually we'll get to the actual project and see what we're talking about today. I did not get a Hawaiian shirt, Jesse. I don't think I have a Hawaiian shirt I really like, if I'm being honest. I have this one shirt. I think my dad gave it to me at some point, but I don't know. I think it looks silly and not the good silly. Okay, so this is the structure of what we're going to talk about today. The first part is we're going to talk about what sort of tests we've seen before and why testing on the front end is a little different. So we're going to review this concept of unit tests. So this is not going to actually run. This is just some example code I wrote. I mean, it could run. But it's just to describe what sort of tests we've seen before. So we've seen this kind of test before on our assessments. It's been taught to some degree. Unit tests. So the key word in there being unit. Unit meaning what we're testing is a unit of functionality. And it's almost like these are atomic tests. We're trying to test the smallest atom of testable thing. And in programming, the smallest atom of thing that can be tested, thing that can be talked about is a function. So unit tests are generally about taking a given function, providing it some example input, checking the output, and if the output matches the expected output, that's good. That's what we that's good. That's passing the test. So here would be an example. Over here, I'm using this library Vite test, which we're not actually going to use, but it works with Vite to grab some functions, describe, it, and expect. And then from our own code, so Vite test is some library that we're using. And from our own code, we maybe had a file called math functions. And that just had a bunch of math functions in it, like add and subtract. And that's what I want to test. So here's my, test file. And the first thing is this describe function. So you see this pattern a lot. In this case, I'm using Vite test, but there's a lot of different libraries that do this. And we would call this a test runner or a testing framework. What it's providing us is the means to just, sort of define tests in these different chunks. So the describe takes two arguments. Its first argument is going to be a description as a string of the test. And the second argument is a callback function, meaning it takes no arguments, but it does something. And what does it do? It does these three other things, which we call it. And it represents an individual test. So it's like the describe represents a block of tests you want to group together. And the its inside represent an individual test. And they have kind of the same format. I'm realizing there's a little bug in there in that these should actually be functions as well. So those shouldn't be objects, but rather functions like that. And what we're doing is we're describing this particular, subtest. So describe would be like, this whole group of tests. It would be an individual test. And I'm saying, I'm describing this test 1 + 1 = 2. And then the function, the second argument, is going to actually run that test. And what it's going to do is we're going to call add 1 and 1. Add is our own function, and it's going to produce some output. And then I could just say, I could have something here instead of writing it like this, theoretically, I could have said, instead of this, I could have just said like, add 1, 1, and I want to make sure that's equal to 2, right? But in practice, we tend to not write this. Why not? Why do we write the other thing? The reason why we write it this way is because this is going to be an approach that it's ultimately the same thing, but the testing suite is aware of it. So in order for this to pass or fail, it can't simply, return true or return false, because there's no reason like that's a little too narrow in terms of defining what passing or failing is. We want something more robust, especially once we're working with things that aren't numbers, things like arrays and objects. And so instead, we're going to have this function expect, which is coming from the test suite as well. The expect is going to take one argument, and that's going to be what your test case or what your function returns. So add 1, 1 will be called like normal, and we would hope it returns 2. Now, expect is going to take as a single argument 2, but expect returns an object. It's going to have these dots on it, so there's going to be methods on the object. And to equal is going to say, okay, if what's inside of that expect is exactly equal to 2, then I return true. But there are often more complex things. So, I mean, I could have expect add 1, 1 to equal 2. But just as well, I could have something like expect, hello world dot to, contain is often one. So dot to contain world. And so that might be useful for a different sort of test where if we're working with strings, maybe we don't just want to say, is it exactly equal to, but we want to say, does it contain something? And so there's actually two things here. The describe and the it, we would call like the testing framework, the test runner library. Whereas expect is its own thing. Expect is what we would call an assertion library. And they work together. One's not really useful without the other, but there's different flavors of these assertion libraries. So some of them use the word should, some of them use the word expect. And they're basically just ways of saying, okay, if this is true, then, pass the test. If this is false, don't pass the test. And it's not going to break your program when it fails, but it will register with the test runner that this passed or failed. So when it's all done, you'll get, 3 out of 4 tests pass, something like that. Let me just bring this back to how it was. So, right. In this case, this represents unit tests in which we're just testing some unit of functionality. We have these individual functions, and we're testing that the output of that function, matches some certain expectation. I hear you, Roger. The syntax is a little confusing. The describe and the its are something you get used to. But for right now, let's just accept this sort of thing. The describes and the its, you can kind of learn to sort of ignore them. They do matter. That syntax has to be there for these tests to run, but they're just a way of like grouping things together. What really matters are these expectations. So as long as you can read that, I would say good. Okay, so these are unit tests, and there's some things we want to notice about them. One is that, as I mentioned, the describe and the its are our testing framework or our test runner. Vite test is one of them that seems to work well with Vite. There's other ones. Mocha is a popular one. Jest is the one that Facebook themselves make and promotes. So if we clicked on the site, we would actually see what Jest looks like. So I like they have a pretty cool little UI here where they're saying like, oh, we're running these tests, some pass, some fail. Maybe you can rerun that one, I guess. I don't know. But that's what it boils down to. And this is, what the output is. It's like some of them are going to pass. Maybe some of them are in the middle of running. Maybe some of them you decide to skip, some fail. And you're just kind of getting a picture of this concept we sometimes call code coverage. We don't really get into this, but the idea of code coverage is just how many of the functions in your code are actually tested. How many of them have a test associated? The goal is 100% code coverage, but that's extremely rare and not really necessary because, as we'll see in the rest of this lecture, unit tests are only so useful. So here's some of the different assertions. We could say to be close to equal, to strict equal. So, maybe this is something where, to equal maybe works with things that, I shouldn't speak actually, because I don't know the exact difference, but sometimes we might have something where we say, 4 is equal to 4.000000001 or something. Whereas to strict equal is saying they have to have the exact same type. They have to have the exact same value. Otherwise, I'm not going to accept this. To have property, maybe we're working with an object. We just want to check, okay, does it have a property called children? You can even test that something throws an error. So, right, we have our different kinds of assertions, and there's way more of these on positive. And right, there's just this idea that we're going to run these functions. We're going to check their output, use an assertion to determine if that output is valid. And if so, we're happy. So coming back here, the second part, whether you're using Mocha or Jest, well, sometimes I think in the case of Jest, they actually include their own assertion library, but Mocha will just be the describe and the it, just the test runner. Whereas Chai is one flavor of testing framework, or sorry, one flavor of assertion library that works with different testing frameworks. So let's click that. And you can tell this is an older website. So Chai itself has, different ways of working with it. So we might have something like, dot should. So should be a string, should have length of 3, expect to have length of 3. Assert dot property T flavors. So there, these are different ways of, asserting that something is as you expect, i.e., how it should be. We'll see today where I made these choices for you. So we're going to be using a specific technology. It's going to use a specific assertion library that works a certain way. You don't have to understand them entirely. You just have to basically learn the specific ones you work with. So there's usually going to be common ones like should be or should have, to equal. And knowing those, you'll be able to make the kind of assertions we would want you to make. And all the tests are pre-written for you anyways. But we wouldn't expect you to know any of these like really advanced ones, like who knows what's in there, like include ordered members is one. Okay, I guess that tests, given an array, that some elements in that array exist in the order specified. So that's like a pretty specific advanced kind of assertion you might want to make. The average person is not going to encounter or need that assertion, as opposed to the essential ones like equal. That's one that we can really understand. We're checking if that first thing is equal to that second thing. All right. Let me move that to another page. So that's unit tests. We're not actually running any, but any questions on unit tests as we've seen them so far? Just this basic version of it, because we don't really expect you to know it. We just want to use it. Well, we expect you to know a little already, but we're just going to use it as a comparison point to this other form of testing we're now going to introduce. Okay. So basic takeaway of unit tests is we run a function with some input, we expect an output, we check that output against some accepted output. If it's the same, you pass the test. If it's not the same, you fail the test. And that's what a test is. So that's a unit test because we're testing a unit of functionality. In this case, we're testing add, subtract. That's a unit of functionality in the form of a function. So we might say, well, let's test our front-end app in the same way. Let's test it with unit tests. And there are technologies to do that. One is React Test Renderer. So that's like a specific technology that's going to help us write tests for React. And this is how it would work. In this case, I'm going to import this, function test renderer from React Test Renderer. And then I'm going to import my own component homepage. And let's just say this is what we expect homepage to be. Really simple. Homepage is a component. It returns a single div, and that div has a single H1 in it with all caps home inside of it. So that's a really simple component. And then, like normal, we might describe. So we're saying all these tests, in this case, just one, represent tests for the homepage. And this test will test if it has an H1 element with text of home as the first child. So the way we would do that is, we use the test renderer to create this homepage, and then we transform it into JSON. And now we have something like this that we can then parse apart and, say, okay, does it match the expectation? Because HTML is ultimately a kind of tree. It can be represented as an object. And so what we're doing here is we're taking that homepage component, we're rendering it. And when we render it, what we get back is HTML. And then we're just going to look through that HTML and see, does it look like what I expect? So this is how we might do a unit test on a React component. But I'm here to tell you, this isn't such a good approach. Why not? Well, can anyone tell me why might this not be a good approach? Like, we're taking this component, it looks like this, we want to test it. Imagine this is like a bigger app. This is like the end result of what we did yesterday. Why might unit testing in this sort of way, where we're just turning it into HTML and looking through that HTML, why might that be an issue? Can anyone anticipate some of the shortcomings of this approach? You went off mic, Chris. You have to answer now. Oh, he went back.
I was gonna sorry. I was gonna say something. I don't know. I was just saying, so we use components to kind of dress up our HTML, so maybe there could be an issue there between is it actually working properly, maybe?
Yeah, so if I understand what you're saying, that's one issue, which is like, if I'm looking over here, so let's say it didn't just have home in it, but let's say it then had something like, let's say it imported something and it had, outlet, right? Well, what happens to outlet? Does that actually get rendered? Are we rendering all the way down? What is outlet? Like, maybe outlet hooks up to something else. Like, because we're using React, it's not as simple as just HTML as the output. It could get pretty complex. And then the question is, are we looking at the React side of it? Are we looking at the HTML side of it? Like, it can get confusing. So that is one issue off the bat. Then there's this issue where even if it's just HTML, it's very brittle. So what I mean by that is that there's kind of two ways a test can fail. One way a test can fail is sort of a true failure, in that that test fails because you thought it had some feature. Like, let's say you thought the H1 had home in it, but it had something else in it. It had, doghouse. And that isn't what you expected, so it fails. And that test is useful. It's actually telling you something. Whereas, if I come back here, what if actually I made some changes over time? Now it no longer looked like this. Now it looked like, this. So let me just make sure these are like lined up. Come on. And ultimately I would comment these out as well. But yeah, let's say I modified my HTML over time. So now I added a div. Well, based on how this test was written, this is going to fail, because when it's turned into JSON, I expect a single div and I expect it to have, a single child, and I expect that child to be an H1. And so it's not very flexible. We say it's brittle, because that to me is not that's not real failure. I changed my code. I changed my code in a way that worked for me. The test fails because the test is so specific. And what ends up happening with a lot of unit tests for things like front end is that your test breaks, and then the solution is not, oh, let me go fix my code. It's, oh, let me go fix my test. And what's the point? If the test isn't helping you, if you're spending all your time maintaining the test, what's the point? And you laugh, Chris, but the funny thing is, testing, people end up in this like religious fervor over testing, where they act like testing is going to save them. And all testing is really doing, at least when you're having these sorts of situations, testing just buys you this false security in your mind that you've secured something, and you really haven't. You're just spending, half your development time now making sure that the tests, are maintained. But a test should ideally be helping you, ensure that something works, and not that you are just maintaining the tests. And in my opinion, if all you added was another level of the div, if that's not an issue, that's not an issue. So the problem is, this has to be very specific. So we call that brittleness. And then I would say more importantly than the brittleness, when we're working with React, we have a bigger problem, which is if we're using a library like React Router, we're using hooks like use state, use effect. It's not going to be so simple to just represent that as HTML. And especially if we want to say like, okay, maybe this is what it looks like when we initially render. Now click something. Now start typing something in. So if we can theoretically work with something like this, because every time we do that, whatever object, represents that, React component, it is changing. Those updates are registered, but you end up mocking things so much that it's like, what am I testing at this point? And so that's the point where I would say to myself, like, well, how do I test things? Because when you test something, really what you're trying to do is say, can the computer do this for me? Because any company that's producing software is going to have at least one manual QA person, because someone's got to like use the website and really test it and say like, okay, if I click here and I click here and I click here, what happens? So if I wanted, let's say I made a new page on LinkedIn, I made the jobs page, and I want to make sure that if I click jobs and I, scroll down this far, then I expect that it's going to reload some more things, right? And then I expect that, the third thing, I'm going to be able to click it. And when I click it, I'm going to be able to see this. And then I'm going to be able to give feedback and say, I'm overqualified for that job. Okay, sorry, LinkedIn, I just gave you some bad data. So I'm overqualified for this Golang job. Okay, let's undo, because who knows? Right. So when I was testing this, what I actually did was, one, I visited the site. Two, I interacted with the site. So I scrolled, then I clicked. And when I scrolled, I expected, okay, something was triggered, maybe like, a request. That's how I got some more data on it. And then I clicked something. And when I click something, I expect that now the page has changed, or even maybe I hover, I expect that the page has changed. Now there's this button. And so when you're testing front end, you want, like, what you would pay a QA person to do is to do that, to go through the site, try all the different scenarios, click things, scroll. And you might not be able to write all of these as an automated test, but it would be nice if we could write an automated test that sort of was aware that it's not just like, an object. It's not just, like in this case, what we're testing is, okay, React, when I run this component or when I render this component, it returns, HTML. I'm going to represent that as an object, and then I'm going to dig through that object. That's not how you really use a website. If React is there to produce websites, the way you test a website is you click, you scroll, you type, you interact, the URL bar, etc. And so what we want at the end of the day is a test that is aware of the browser, a test that's aware of the browser environment. And so while we have unit tests, we have this other test called an end-to-end test. Let's actually see this. So I'm gonna type like testing hierarchy. So a lot of people would say, like, there's these different versions of these different levels of testing. Interesting. They're not using the word end-to-end here. But basically at the very lowest level of unit testing, you're saying like this relies only on the functionality inside of that function. It's extremely self-contained. I guess there might be this level called component testing. So maybe if you were testing a component in isolation and you just wanted to say, if I give it certain props, does it now reflect that it received those props? Then there's this level called integration testing. I mean, you don't have to always break it down into all these levels. But integration testing would mean like, okay, well, I'm trying to connect to this other service. Is that basic connection working? And then what they're calling UI and API testing, that's what I would call end-to-end testing. What you're saying is like, okay, assuming everything's hooked up, does the website work? Can I move through it in the way a real user would? And then at the very top level, you might have manual testing, because there could be things that you want to test that are so involved that writing a script is probably not the best approach. You really want a real person doing it. So what would be, no one's using the word end-to-end testing. Why not? I want to teach you guys an outdated term. Right. This is what I would call the testing pyramid. The basics of it are unit test. You might have a lot of unit tests where you're testing specific functionality. Integration tests. I don't necessarily write these, but that's just saying, like, does the hookup happen? Are these two services actually talking to each other? And then end-to-end tests it's called end-to-end because when someone uses your browser, a browser to, use your website, that's end-to-end. They're going all the way to the server. They're getting the website. They're now interacting with the website. While interacting with it, that might send more requests to the server. So end-to-end test means everything's already hooked up. And now, does it work? Does it not work? Okay, gonna look at the chat quick. Chris, that's a really good point. Yeah, AI will eventually be good at writing tests, but there's kind of a tricky thing there where it's like, if AI is running all the tests, are you going to trust it? You're still going to want someone to look at it and be like, are those good tests? And so I think that's the biggest obstacle to AI just generating code at this point. And then also the fact that a lot of times the tricky part is not necessarily testing the parts of your code that are going to be, React specific, but testing the parts of your code that are going to be business specific. So it's like the AI isn't going to necessarily know, oh, because you work at this company, we have an on season and we have an off season. We have to make sure like this or that. Who knows? Things that are unique to the company, right? You're going to want a person who's like experienced something. But let's see how we might write an end-to-end test. So the same test I wrote up here, where I kind of did it in this, contrived way where I rendered the component and then I looked at what sort of HTML it produced, and then I dug into that HTML. As an end-to-end test, I might do it like this. So Psi here represents this testing framework, Cypress, which I'm going to introduce today. But as you see, the describe and the it are the same. Cypress actually will give us those as well, but Cypress is going to give us an ability to essentially work with a browser. And what this is going to do is say, okay, first visit this page. It's actually opening a browser, going to that page, and it expects that page to exist. So you might have to host that page simultaneously, but still it's going to be able to visit that page. And then I'm going to say, okay, get an H1. And just like the way selectors normally work, this isn't going to know, oh, well, that H1 is like 4 levels down in a div. Because I'm saying get H1, it's just going to get the first, if in this case, only H1 on the page. And then I'm going to be able to say, okay, it should contain the text home. I could also have wrote should have .text home, but contain will actually catch it even if the H1 had like home page in it or something. And so this is a little different than the expect syntax we've seen, but basically Cypress just provides it as like a string saying contain.text, should.be.a, who knows what it is. And that's how it's going to associate some like specific assertion with some specific value and some specific element it's actually looking up. So basically Cypress is going to work with a real browser, and it's going to be able to parse that HTML just like, you would with like jQuery or working with CSS selectors. You're going to be able to work with elements, and it knows that you don't have to say like, oh, well, this H1 is, this object and it has a children key on it, which is a list. And I want to take the first thing in the list and check that it has the value home. It kind of understands you're working with HTML. So the first big thing, we visit it. We are actually visiting something in our browser. And then the second big thing, we're going to use element names and selectors to kind of dig through our site in the way that, we ourselves might do that. And here's my comparison of unit versus end-to-end testing. Unit tests are great for APIs because an API is like you make that one call and you check that it returns exactly that data. End-to-end tests a little better for UIs because UIs are like these moving things. We haven't shown that yet, but we want to be able to click things. We want to be able to interact with the page. There's some other comparisons, tiny versus large. Okay, I guess so. White box versus black box. I think white box meaning it's all exposed. You can see everything it's working with. With the end-to-end test, we're treating it as a bit of a black box where when I'm visiting that site, I have no idea if that site was written in React or Angular or something else. I'm just kind of saying, okay, well, does this site work? Because I'm treating it like a user would. I don't see the implementation details. And then this is a big part. Unit tests are isolated from the world. Unit tests are these self-contained things. You're really just running a function. Whereas end-to-end tests, you're assuming all the pieces have already been fit together. So you're assuming there is a browser. This website is hosted. If this website relies on other resources, I can reach those resources. You're testing what a user would test, which is if a user goes to your page, they don't want, some part of it to be mocked. If that service is down, it should break, right? Because it wouldn't work for them. It won't work in your end-to-end test. So the end-to-end test is really just mocking a browser and then treating it like, any user would. It's just that it's automated. So you yourself, because as you'll find, if any of you become front-end developers, I've certainly done this a lot myself, you do some feature, you have to test it. Often you won't write a test until it's really done, but every time you might have to refresh, click, fill in, click, and that gets old fast if you're having some persistent bug, because maybe you'll do that. You'll do your 6 or 7 steps to test whether it works or not. It doesn't work. You go back to your code, you change one thing, you got to do your 7 UI testing steps again. And so these tests are nice because once you do have this, like, oh, I do this, then I do this, then I do that, it's going to be easier to automate it than to click it all yourself. And I just like this picture. I don't know that it's really accurate. Unit tests do not combine to make one all-powerful end-to-end test. But it is a bit of the difference that, like, let's say we were testing each one of these like Zord type things. We could test the red one in isolation from the blue one. We could say, okay, they're totally unrelated. Whereas the end-to-end test is saying, okay, I'm assuming they're all connected. Now, can this thing fly? Yes, it can, because, Black Tiger has wings and he's part of the whole thing. Can't wait till Zords are real. Nice cat, Grace. Okay, so let's take a little break now. When we come back, we're actually going to do this. So everything I've talked about up till now is just sort of, let's discuss the difference between unit tests and end-to-end tests. What we're going to do for the rest of this class is actually write end-to-end tests using this language called, or this framework called Cypress. I will walk us through this because there is some setup, but this is the kind of thing I would want you to code along with. And the way we're going to do that, which we'll do when we come back, is we'll actually work with, I actually have it here as a project already, but essentially we're going to take, the existing solution from yesterday, and we're going to start writing tests for it because that's how you would normally do it. You'd have some state of your app, and then you'd say, now let's add tests. So yeah, that is what we're going to work with. And we'll walk through that when we get back, but let's give everybody a 10-minute break. We're going to come back at 10:42, I guess. I'm going to resume. We are recording now, Katie. Okay, so coming back here, I guess I'm going to go to my day 5. And you should also have this now. This video start part 4 of Cypress. I'm going to open it up. So this is not I mean, I guess if you want to use this exact same file, you can repeat this. I'm just going to delete some things because they represent that Cypress stuff. So deleting this, that was that cypress.config, deleting this whole folder called Cypress. And if I go to my package.json here, you'll notice I have this dev dependency Cypress, going to delete that as well. And maybe just to make sure, I'm going to delete node modules. So I'm really starting over. And as a result, the first thing I have to do is npm install. So that's going to get all of my node modules in this node modules folder. And as you see, I have a couple of dependencies, Axios, React Router, and then these dev dependencies, which I will remind you, Those are things that you only need when developing, when the app is all packaged up, which you would do with like npm run build. I suppose I could take this out as well. When the app is all packaged up, these won't be included. So it's a way of like making your app a little smaller when you're actually in production, because you're not bundling the things that the developers needed, but that, you know, a standard user won't need.
Hey, Ben.
Yes.
Is the video store part for Cypress not like a Google Classroom assignment thing that we can just clone?
Well, it's the same. It is the assignment from yesterday. So if you just get the solution branch, so I have that over here, as in you can go here, you know, this is what mine looks like because my name is Aloof Buddha on GitHub. But basically you can clone your thing from yesterday, switch to this, you know, go in there, switch to the solution branch. And then at that point, you will be able to use that as the same starting point.
Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The only thing is that the part of the reason I'm going to be doing it over here is because there are times we will see where there are times where you change your app ever so slightly to account for the testing. So if I were to look at, let's say, film page, last time I probably didn't have this class name home link. So sometimes you give something a specific class name just so that it'll be very easy to target it when testing. And so that's the only differences to the app that have been made, but functionally speaking, the app should be identical. And what I'm going to do right now is actually run it to make sure. So npm run dev. And here's my app, should be the same as yesterday, 0, 4, 2, 1. I can click on one of them, Shazam, everyone's favorite movie. Can check it out a few times. And return to the homepage. There should only be 1 out of 4 available now. Indeed, there is. So this is our app we created from yesterday, or that we finished yesterday. What is Creed rated? Only PG-13. Okay. Shazam. I'm just curious. PG-13. What about 65? PG-13. These are all PG-13. Snowy Day in Oakland, if I remember, was NC-17. No, it's PG-13. Okay. I never even heard about that movie when it came out. Cool. So our app is working, and now the question is, how do we test it? Okay. So let's come back here. Oh, let me make these nice. So this is where I actually have my project. Let me collapse that for now. And coming back here is where I have my instructions. So we got this far where, you know, we installed our dependencies and we ran our app. So for anyone who's following along, actually coding it, are you that far? As in, are you able to run the app and see, you know, that functionality from yesterday? Yes. Okay. If anyone can't, let me know, because that's our basic starting point, which is we have an app. Now we want to test it.
When we switch to the solution branch, do we need to redo npm install?
Sometimes, not necessarily. Are you having a specific issue?
Oh no, just asking.
I think no. But the reason why it's no is because if we look over here, usually you're going to have a .gitignore. And part of the .gitignore is you say ignore node modules. And as long as you're ignoring node modules, so currently you still see it there, but if I were to say git add .gitignore, so I'm adding that to the project. Did I do that or not? Well, basically it should not care about node modules at this point. And because it doesn't care about node modules, when you switch to different branches, that doesn't change. Whereas if you were tracking it, you might have to, because it's saying, hey, that file, you know, maybe doesn't exist on solution, or maybe it looks different on solution.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So just to answer the chat stuff, one, Jesse, the vulnerability stuff, it's not really so worth getting into. Basically, if this was a production level thing, they're just letting you know that, you know, your project your project has some dependencies. Those dependencies have dependencies. Downstream, there could be many, many dependencies, even if your project only seemingly requires one or two. And they're saying, you know, some of those dependencies have reported that they have some kind of security vulnerability, high, moderate, low. And they're basically letting you know that because maybe if they have that security vulnerability and you rely on them, you now also have that vulnerability. And that might be a time now that you want to update that dependency. And when you update that dependency, maybe you have to change things in your own code. So it's basically saying, like, for production level stuff, if this piece is important, if you might be using it in such a way that you now also have that vulnerability, you know, this is something we want to inform you about. But it doesn't automatically make those changes for you, because chances are, if a newer version lacks that vulnerability and they automatically pushed you to that newer version, it could break your code. So it's not something you have to be too concerned about until you're making, like, I mean, basically you'll work at a company that will tell you whether you need to care or not. And I've definitely worked at companies where you're getting some warnings saying, like, oh, you know, we have 4 high vulnerabilities, and it just doesn't matter because it's not something you're tracking or worried about. But of course it could be. Like, years and years ago, there was that Heartbleed bug that affected Apple. So everyone that was using the library OpenSSH, the vulnerability that was discovered in there affected everyone. And that was such an important bug that it meant that, like, your things were significantly insecure for, like, accessing sensitive data. Basically, a password simply wasn't being checked. It was being requested, but whatever you gave back, it was okay. Grace, it was called, like, the Heartbleed bug. It was some time ago. It's not really too important, but we're going to ignore these vulnerability things while we're testing things. Chris, in terms of the rebase stuff, I'm not sure exactly what's wrong, but there's always the possibility of doing a force pull. So I don't know the exact thing off the top of my head, but it's usually something like git pull, you know, -- force, and then, like, origin/solution. And then you're just going to say, I don't care what I currently have, pull the, you know, the canonical version of this code and overwrite my local stuff, and then it will work. But if it's not working, we can cover that later. Let's just go ahead right now. You can watch it. Okay, so we want to work with Cypress. That's what we're doing here. So we want to save it as a dependency, but note I'm going to do this -- save dev. And that's because I don't want it in my regular dependencies. I want it in my dev dependencies. And the reason for that is that Cypress is not going to matter when, you know, we're not going to bundle that with the app like React, because it's not required for our app to run. It's only required for the dev environment to test things. So I'm going to install that. It's taking a minute. Eventually, what's going to update is down here. So currently, these are all my dependencies, but I expect eventually this will give me Cypress as well. If it's stuck, I might just do, like, Command C or, you know, Control C. Let's try that again. Maybe it'll complete this time. Dang, something's up. Something's up. Might regret that I deleted node modules. What? It's just hanging here.
Mine's also hanging, but it's at a different point in the install.
Mine completed. It just took a second.
I'm just hitting enter right there. If you're ever frustrated, you can hit enter. It doesn't do anything, but it's worth knowing. There we go. Okay, took forever, and now it registered all my enters. Okay, so finally I have Cypress here. And that means I can start working with Cypress. So let's see our next step. Okay, next up, I'm actually going to add a script, right? Because when I include a dependency, I can now work with that project. But just like Vite, unless I have Cypress locally, if I start typing Cypress, it's going to say, I don't know what that is. Whereas if it's a local dependency, and in here I were to say, okay, I have a script, And I'm going to call that script test, right? And then I say Cypress. Now it is going to know about it. So if I were to write npm run test, it knows about Cypress, which is not the exact command I want, but you see it actually knows about it. So what I'm actually going to do, just to follow the pattern on their website, I'm going to write something called cy::open. That will be the name of my script. And what I want to run in that case is Cypress followed by the subcommand open. So this is where you should follow along. If you've now created that script, we're going to be able to run npm run cy::open. And we don't have, as you see, we don't have any of those other files yet. So let's see what happens when we run Cypress like this. I'll hit enter. Saying this is your first time using it. So it does some stuff. Let's just keep reading that. Okay, so it's saying, okay, it had to verify something. It actually downloaded something. Okay, so now it opened up this browser window, right? Its own browser window. And this is the really cool thing about Cypress. We're going to have our own little test runner now. So it actually offers two kinds of tests, but we're going to go with end-to-end. And you'll notice it says not configured right here. So everything we're doing now is just to set it up for the assessment. This will have been done for you, but I'm going to click this. Okay, now it's saying like I'm going to create some files for you. It's telling us the content of those files. Some of these we're going to need, some of them we're not. But let's just, include all of them. Can I uninclude them? No, I can't. It's going to create all these files for us now with like basic starting points. And this is going to let us use all of Cypress. But like, for instance, I've never touched any of these three files, so I don't really know what they do. But for instance, the cypress.config, that's necessary. That's just to say, here's some basic configuration. Okay, now that we've done that, let's come back to our code. There actually is some change. One, there is this file here, cypress.config.js. So we don't have to change anything, but it did produce this file for us. And this file is going to allow us ultimately to change some things. So for instance, in this end-to-end object, I believe if I open it up and I start saying like base URL. So I'm going to be able to say like, oh, well, I just want to be able to say go to /. So the base of the URL we're testing is www.google.com. And then within Cypress, I'm going to be able to say, open up / as opposed to open up www.google.com/. But we'll remove that for right now. So we're not changing anything there yet. And then you'll also notice there's this new folder Cypress. So everything you do with Cypress will end up in this Cypress folder. And it created some sub stuff for us. We don't need to look at it because we don't use it. But just to notice it made this folder. So
And could I ask a quick question real quick?
Yes.
Is this going to be expected for us to set up for the assessment today?
No, it's all going to have been done for you. So you're just going to have to run a pre-existing command we created for you called cy::open, but all the configuration files will already be there. This is just to show you that, if you did it from scratch, this is what it does.
Okay. Yeah, I thought that was the case. Just want to make sure. Sorry about interrupting you.
Not an interruption. We're here for you. Okay, coming back here, in fact, maybe I'll move this to another page. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. Now it's saying choose a browser. We don't really need to worry about this Electron thing. That's a way of people making like browser or basically making apps using technologies like React, making like, actual Windows or Mac OS apps, but we're just going to use Chrome. So using Chrome, and you'll have to have Chrome installed, but I'm assuming you do. Using Chrome, we're going to start end-to-end testing with Chrome. So I'll click that button. Opening. Okay. So now it's going to say, like, do you want to scaffold example specs? Do you want to create a new spec? Let's say create new spec. And then it's going to say, okay, I'm going to be saving this in Cypress. I'm going to be saving it in the end-to-end folder. Then this is what I'm going to call it. So going back to my doc, let's see what I did at this point, just so we follow along. So this was that page. We clicked end-to-end. We chose the browser. Now we're at this point, create new spec. I called it test-1.
Hey, Ben, I
Yes.
think you might have to slow down a little bit. Jesse's saying she's trying to catch up.
Okay, Jesse, yeah, we can definitely slow down. Where are you at right now, Jesse, in terms of the setup?
Honestly, I don't even know. Cypress opened, but I never saw anything that said, like it said like run end to end, but it looks totally different than,
Can you share your screen?
yes.
Okay, I'll stop sharing for a second.
It's on advanced.
Michael, I'm looking in the chat. What operating system are you on?
Ubuntu.
Yeah, I'm guessing I had a feeling it was something like that. It could be that Cypress is having some trouble working with Ubuntu. So you're not on WSL, you're on Ubuntu.
Oh, well, I'm on WSL. Yeah.
Oh, okay, got it. Well, we can look into that after. It could be that it needs some other dependency called libnss3.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I don't mind just watching everything you do. I usually don't even follow along anyway, so I'm pretty used to just like trying to take it in by watching you code.
Okay, fair enough. Well, Jesse, it looks like you clicked on the thing that said like just scaffold everything, so it created a lot of things for you.
I had a page that was like this, and I thought I clicked like, because that's the only place I've seen like the end to end, like the green button.
Yes. Give me a second. We are actually, it looks like in 24 minutes, we have the retro. And so Francisco's telling me we might just want to see this. This is definitely something I can go over during the thing later today where we actually do the review. But really, it might be better just to see this. And like I said, this is just going to be set up for you.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll share my screen again. Okay, so coming back there, test1.sci. So I'm just going to make this test called test1.sci, and I'll create the spec, and it's telling me what it's going to make. So I'll just say, okay, cool. And I don't need to worry too much about what it's doing. We'll actually see the body of this test in a second, but as you see, it's saying the body is just visit this website, which already exists, example.cypress.io. So over here, we see it visited their website. But this is in Cypress / end-to-end, and I called it test-1. So all the tests have to have a .sci and then .js, because that's how Cypress is going to know to pick it up as a test, because it ends in .sci.js. So going back here, going back to my own file, I have this end-to-end thing, and I have one test in there, and this is what it looks like. So this is the point where I'm going to want to actually start testing my own website. So coming back here, I might look at what I did in this case. So this is what it started as, because they just generated that for us. But I want it to work with my project. And I'll do this step in a second. But first, I'm just going to copy paste this, and then we'll read it. So I'm changing this to be my test. And what it's going to do is say, okay, test the header. Displays video store. Visit localhost 5173. Get H1. It should maybe have .text video store. So what we're saying there is that when we go to our website, which I believe I still have open somewhere over here, we should be able to go to the website at this address, and then we should be able to go into the site, and we would expect there to be an H1 containing video store. So let's see if our test runs. Coming back here, and we'll see it over here. So I'm going to refresh. Okay, so it didn't work. Why not? It's saying connection refused. that's, you know, that site isn't running. Well, is that site running? As it turns out, it's not running. And so this is an interesting thing about end-to-end testing. You have to be running the app at the same time. So coming back here, I might look here and I'll say, okay, well, you know, I could exit this so we could actually see. I want to run Cypress. So I'm running it right there. You know, I click this, I click start. It's not quite working yet if I click it because it can't get there. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to come back here and I'm actually going to open a second thing because I want to run two things in the terminal at the same time. And that's where I'll say npm run dev. Now I'm running my server. So if I click that, I would see indeed I am running it. So I can refresh and it's still there. Come back here, I refresh this and it is running. And you see like it's making all these requests and stuff. So you can see that all populate step by step. And all we wanted to assert is that it had that H1 video store, and indeed it's passing now. So two things to maybe see. One, it could get old to have to write this every time. So if I come back here, I'll see like I'm actually saying visit, you know, the website / well, if I don't want to do that every time, if I just want to say visit /, that's one use of cypress.config where I'm able to give it, you know, in this end-to-end object, I could give it another thing. So over here, I'll say base URL. And I'm just saying every time you see in me say sci dot, you know, what was it? Sci dot visit / I actually mean sci dot visit / this whole thing /. And the other good thing about that is, you know, now, well, it will still pass. But what I like about that, especially, is that if I come here and I'm going to open these up again. So let's stop running this. So we're not running our website anymore. And I'll stop running this. So I'm not running Cypress anymore. Now, if I run npm run sciopen, I'll click this. It's actually going to say, hey, you set up a base URL and I can't access it. So I think you want to start that. So that's the sign for me to go here, do npm run dev. Now I'll come back here. If I do try again, it knows about it. And now we see our test running. So this is the basic use case of Cypress, that we have this running test, we're able to visit it, and you see it actually happens step by step here. So I'm visiting the site. There's nothing on the site yet. Then by this step, the site has loaded, get H1. I'm getting the H1. Then I ran my expectation. I said I expect it to have the text video store. It does. And then everything down here, which is in like gray and italics, they're saying this is a request that happened in the background. These requests are actually happening one by one. So you see we have request response. So it's actually showing us what, you know, what the after effect of that request was. But these are all happening after that step. And we'll see how to handle that in a second, how you deal with the fact that maybe you're making requests. But this passed. Let's see what happens when it doesn't pass. The title is video store. Coming all the way back, where am I? Here. No, coming all the way back. Sorry about juggling all these windows. So let's say I said it should have text, you know, Vimeo store. Come back here. The test automatically reran. What happened? Okay, so it visited the site, it got the H1. Then I tried to do an assert. It said expected H1 to have text Vimeo store, but the text was video store. So that's like a pretty good error. Then over here, it's actually saying I waited 4 seconds. It never changed to what I expected it to be because maybe it would have changed over time. This is exactly where it failed. It failed in the .should. And then at that point, it has something like print to console. I can click that. And if I open my console, the screen gets pretty busy, but we can move stuff around. If I open my console, I'll actually see it printed some useful stuff. It said, you know, command assert. This is what I was working with. So it actually is showing us the H1. Here's the message. Here's the error. That's somewhat useful. But what's also useful is that I have these other like visual buttons here. So this target button, I can click that. And that's actually going to let me walk through the page and say, okay, it's this I want to talk about. Or maybe this, or if it's not getting the right one, I can just type it, H1. Now it knows I'm talking about the H1. Now I can click this print to console button. Now it's actually saying, okay, this is exactly what I saw. And now like I can use that to debug and say like, okay, I saw Video Store. That is what it contains. It was looking for Vimeo Store. What's going on there? And so this visual editor is going to be pretty useful for telling when stuff works, when it doesn't, and why. Della, I see you're still having an issue with the connection. I think what we're going to do is just make sure we can read some of these tests because we only have like 15 minutes now until the retro. And then at that point, we'll have that review later today. The review will be thorough. And as you'll see, we'll make sure everyone can get your test running because this is already pre-set up for you for the assessment. Okay, I'm going to close this for now. Coming back here, here's my single test. Let's make it work again. And as you'll see, it'll automatically rerun for us. So now this is passing. We could see that here, check mark. So let's see what our document has now. This is our test running, passing. Okay, everything else at this point is just learning specific things Cypress gives you. So it was a fair amount of setup, but now how do we do things for Cypress? So there's a lot in here, but we'll walk through each thing. I'm going to grab this and I'm going to create another test with it. So just like here, I'm going to have, you know, a new file, test-2.sci.js. And just to show you, that is already picked up. I didn't put anything in it, but it's already picked up. No test found. So let me copy paste that code, save it. So we'll read through this, but let's just show, just want that to be slash now. Let's just show that, let's just show it running. So coming back here, it's already ran for us, but we can look at it step by step. Is it failing? It is failing at a point. We're going to see why. Okay, well, this is something we can fix. Well, we look at it, we visit slash, we got that H1. It contained Video Store, we're good. Then I expected it to have an H2 with inventory on it. It does, we're good. Then this is new, I waited a second. Why did I wait? I waited because if I don't wait and it's making some API calls, I might have to wait. And so you can wait as long as you want, but the waiting there is just to determine an amount of time by which, you know, calling an API might happen, and then that data is returned. As you see, these populate like one by one. Okay, the next thing I did is look for something with the class inventory item. There were 4 of them, and I asserted that there were 4. Then I looked at that first inventory item. We'll see how to do that. I grabbed its child H3, so I expected it to have a direct child H3. I expected it to have the text "A Snowy Day in Oakland." Then I looked at that same item. I looked at its image. I expected it to at least have a source attribute. So there's limits to what you can test. Maybe, you know, I just didn't want to say, okay, here's this big URL, and I expect it to be exactly this URL. Then it looks like it failed down here because it was looking for something with the class item actions. And what it's saying is there was an inventory item first. It had a child action items, or maybe it didn't actually. It never found dot item actions, probably because it's not there. And maybe we would even see that. We would say, okay, I'm going to click this. actually want to see this whole box here. We print it to the console. So what does an inventory item look like? Okay, an inventory item has a div with inventory item. It has an H3. It has an image. That's how I was able to see all those. But it looks like I gave it a different class. Now it has a class num available. So I have to update the test to reflect that. So let's come back here and look at our test. So exactly what it was doing in there, it's doing here. We're visiting something. We're getting that H1 and then checking that it, contains or has, like this, have a specific text. We're waiting a second for the API call. Now we're looking for something called inventory item. And as you see, there's other things. We could say have.length. So what we're going to show here are all the ones you need to know. But if you looked at Cypress's website, there's lots and lots of these things you might be able to care about. We expect there's exactly 4. And then this is something you might not have seen in a while. This is what's called a CSS pseudo selector. So this is saying, when I got .inventory item, there were actually 4 of them. I want to get just the first one, and that's a useful way of getting just the first one. And then this here is saying a direct child. So it would work as well if I said this, but this means at any level there's an H3. And this is just me being more specific. And this is all CSS selector stuff. So Cypress is not reinventing anything. It's just using this idea of selectors to target elements. So I'm checking that it has this text. And then in this case, I'm saying I expect it to have an image as well. And I expect that image to have an attribute called source. So I could also give it a third argument and say it would have this specific source. And if I did that, now I would see, I come back here. It got the image. Okay, I expected it to have the source google.com, but the value was something else, so it failed. But if we just want to check, okay, it has a source, as opposed to it has a source with a specific value, I don't need to give that argument. And then finally, this is failing because when I look at inventory item, or I look at the thing that matches class inventory item, I look at the first one, I expect it to have a child with item actions. And if I were to look at my code here, I would see, okay, I believe this is what we're talking about. This is where class inventory item is. It found the H3, it found the image, but this is what the class is called, num available. So my test was written incorrectly. I actually want .num available. And I expect that it's going to contain a text containing 0 available. So will it? It will be something available. And because we know that, the initial value for this one should be 0, it should all work. Let's see that. Yep, this whole one passes now. Great. Okay, so that's our example of a slightly more involved test using Cypress. How do we feel? I know this one, we're getting down to the wire again. All right. Anyone have anything to say about these?
I think it's pretty straightforward. Like the error messages are easy to read, and like what you were showing, I think it's like easy to follow on like obviously a pre-written test.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Yeah, they will be pre-written. But yeah, that's kind of the whole part of the reason why this is going to be useful is because you do get good error messages. You have this visual runner. It's going to be able to easily, you're going to be able to easily rerun a test. So in the time we have left, let's just see some other tests we could write. So this was our test 2. The main new thing we introduced was sci.wait, but also that we have other assertions like have.length, the pseudo selector. So I want to show there's other ways I could accomplish it without the pseudo selector. So let's say I wanted to get exactly that first inventory item. I could, break this apart where I say, instead of .inventory item, pseudo selector first, immediate child H3, might be able to break this down a little more. Maybe it's easier for me to read that. I would say, okay, get inventory item. If I printed that, that actually gets 4 things. But I have this, I could say dot EQ, and then I could give it the index I care about. I care about the first one. At that point, I can do another dot get. I'm saying now that I have this thing inventory item, within there, get an H3. So maybe not necessarily an immediate child, because I didn't do it in that, selector way, but just as long as there's an H3 that exists within whatever this element this represents, I'm good to go. And in that H3, now that's where I expect that it should contain text, a snowy day in Oakland. And let's just make sure that still works. It does. So you see this broke it down a little more. We got inventory item, which represents 4 things. The equals 0 gets just that one thing, and you can see it all print here. So in this case, we're saying, yeah, that's 4 things, elements 4. This one represents exactly 1. You see it looks like this. Then we're getting the H3. Oh, that actually doesn't quite work like I expected. I assumed it would be the H3 for that one. But this still works. Oh, because it contains it. Yeah. So that's not ideal, honestly, in my mind. I wonder, yeah, because I guess it really does prefer that selector way of doing it, because in this case, this get is separate from this get. This is saying just I'm looking for H3s anywhere on the page, not necessarily as a child of this one. So it sounds like it really does want you to use this selector way, where we use this to grab exactly what we want. But the good news is that selectors are a way you can be as specific as you want for everything. So I believe we can even do like nth child. I forget the exact syntax for it, 2. Let's see if that works. It's going to fail, but it's going to fail because the one it's talking about has the text Shazam, Fury of the Gods. So we're going to be able to use these selectors to get whatever we want. I guess in that case, that would work. Or I guess it calls it 1. So nth child, I guess, is not 0 index, but 1 index. That would make sense because 2 got us Shazam. Okay. But, instead of doing nth child, we can use first. And like I said, all the tests are pre-written for you. Yeah, stand down is going to be in a few minutes, not stand down. Sorry. We misspoke. We're doing the retro in 3 minutes, but we're going to be able to cover this and everything we need during that review. So just to see some of the other stuff we have, testing routes. So maybe I write another test like this, just to show that, because we're mocking a browser, we can actually test that our routes work as expected. I only want to do this part. So I'm going to /film, going to a specific ID, going to wait just in case there's API stuff to wait for. I'm going to get an H2, expect it to have this, get an H3, expect it to have that. I'm going to expect something with home link, and then I'm going to be able to click on it. And then after I click on it, I'm going to be able to run something like this to say, now I expect, to look at the URL and then it has a path named /. So I'm making sure that if I click that home link, I do go to the home page. Let's see that run. Okay, it happens very fast, but you can walk through it step by step. We visit it, we wait. By the time we wait, all this has happened. Now I'm going to say get an H2. It does have an H2 with details. Get an H3. It does say Shazam, Fury of the Gods. Get the home link. Okay, that's that button over there. Click it. Now, Cypress will do this before and after. I want to see, this is the before I click. This is the after I click. We are on the home page. And now I'm actually checking. Okay, well, as you see here, this is in gray and it's italics. This is saying, well, something actually changed here. The URL is new. I'm going to check the location. The location is correct. It's actually, and this will tell us right here, the path was slash, so it was correct. And if I look, where is it? If I look over here, maybe in the before of the click, no, I'm not printing that URL anywhere, but this is the URL we started at. So that's the URL it sees initially, but ultimately the URL ends up being slash. Okay. So just coming back here, I believe there's only one more test. So what we showed here is that you could do .click. And like I said, just reiterating, all the tests are written for you, just about reading them and following them. The last test I'm showing is test 4 here. And this is just to show that you can use for loops. So in this test, I guess I'll copy it just so we could see it. Run. I know we're at time. If Francisco's here, just one more second. One more test here. I'll rename that test 4. What are we doing? Well, we're going to visit slash. So we're going to visit the home. We wait for the API stuff. Now I'm getting the first inventory item. I click on it. I expect it to have a checkout button. I expect it to already be disabled because in that case, like I believe if I go to my site here, right, I'm clicking this first item, it has 0 available. So the checkout button starts out disabled. And I want to click return 4 times. So I can actually do that. I can just have a for loop and I'm saying, okay, 4 times now. Each time I would expect the text to have 0 out of 4. And then click the return button. And then when that's done, I expect the text to have contents 4 out of 4 and for the return button to be disabled. And now finally, I'm going to click back home. So this is another kind of CSS selector, if it's written correctly. And that's a CSS selector that says, I'm looking for the thing with slash. And that's going to be identical, or with an href equal to slash. That's going to be identical to actually having clicked on the button. So last time we said .home link. It's ultimately going to be the same element. I just wanted to show another way of doing it. We're going to click it. And we're going to expect that when we come back, we're going to have an inventory item. The first one is going to have a num available, which I believe is still called num available. Is that right? Yeah. Which should contain the text 4. So let's see that test run. Refresh. Test 4. Okay, it happens real fast, but let's walk through it. Visit. Wait. These populate one by one. Get the first one. Click it. So that's showing us the before and after. Now we're at a new URL. Get the checkout button. It should be disabled. Get the number available. It should be 0 out of 4. This is part of our loop now. Get the return button, click it. And we repeat that for all 4 of these. We're checking it's 1 out of 4 now, 2 out of 4, 3 out of 4. Checking that it's 4 out of 4. Should be disabled. Get that button, click it. Now you're at a new URL. Now get this element, which let's see it. You're getting this element, and we're asserting that it says 4 of it. It has a 4 in there at the end. So these tests can get kind of involved, but it's cool because otherwise you would have to do all this manually, and this is a nice way to not do it manually. So yeah, that's everything. We're a few minutes over. Francisco, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm assuming we want to jump right into retro, right?
It's your call.